Hi, this is Jerry Fiscus, the Lone Man, and we're here to talk about escrow with Diane Keefe Bunnell. So Diane, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, Jerry, it's been a long journey. I started in my escrow career in 1972. Things were very different back then than they are today. I am one of only 2 certified escrow officers here in the Santa Clarita area, having been given my certification by the California Escrow Association in 1996, and that's a certification that I'm very proud of. It requires that I stay updated at all times.
So, what is an escrow?
Well, basically, an escrow is a means of protecting the buyer and seller that have entered into a contract and to follow the terms of the contract, protect the funds that the buyer has brought in until all conditions have been met and we're able to deliver those funds to the seller and the documents to the buyer.
And what kind of transactions actually go through escrow?
Anything can go through escrow that has a monetary value that somebody wants to deliver to another party and protect those funds and or the item. The escrows that are most common are real estate transactions, involve the transfer of a real estate property, either a single family residence, commercial, building, business, vacant land, anything like that. You can escrow anything from a valuable piece of art to a car, to a timeshare, to anything that has monetary value that somebody wants to deliver to another party for monetary consideration.
Okay, and why is an escrow even necessary?
Well, Jerry, you wouldn't want to purchase a piece of property, home or vacant land or anything else, from somebody that you didn't know and hand that person a couple $100,000.
Just on a handshake, you don't do
Just
that?
on a handshake, you don't do that. That's
Okay.
many years ago. That's where the escrow holder.
Because
Came
many years ago, a handshake was worth something.
Of course. But as a buyer, especially, you would want assurance that any money that you're going to place in a trust account with an escrow officer, escrow company, is protected. So an escrow holder is a means of protecting that investment, basically, and to also make sure that the terms of the contract are followed and are met 100%.
Who handles the escrow transaction?
The escrow transaction, at least here in Southern California, is handled by a trained professional, an escrow officer. In other states, they are handled by either attorneys or other types of settlement agents.
Mm-hmm. And what does a buyer entering escrow need to do, and what does he need to know?
The first thing that the buyer does is to produce the earnest money deposit or the good faith deposit into escrow, which shows their good faith in the transaction. And then they will be contacted by the escrow holder, the escrow officer, to sign certain documents and perform certain duties. And it's important that the buyer maintain a constant communication with all the parties in the escrow, including the escrow officer, their real estate agent, their lender, and other parties in the transaction.
So, just to digress for a second, so once the check is given to you, the check is made out to the escrow company, let's say for an earnest money deposit, let's say hypothetically of $20,000. Show me how the path of that check, where it goes and where it ends up.
Well, generally in the beginning of an escrow, it's a personal check. That personal check is made payable to the escrow company. It is delivered to us by either the buyer or the real estate agent. And that deposit is then placed into a secure trust account that we maintain at all times. And it's kept in there until it is utilized for the transaction toward the end.
So once the escrow instructions are ready, what happens then?
Once the escrow instructions are ready for both parties, the way that I handle it is I will contact my buyer and seller, introduce myself, make sure that they feel comfortable with who they're dealing with, that they know that they're working with a trained professional, and I will then offer to review those documents with both the buyer and seller, either in person or on the phone.
So purchases per se, the buyer or the seller typically do not select the escrow company. The realtor does, doesn't?
That is correct.
How's that work?
That is correct.
So they really don't know who the escrow officer is until you make the phone call?
Typically, they do not. Right.
Okay, unless they've done business with you before.
So it's my job to introduce myself and to make them feel comfortable with who they're dealing with.
Okay. And so let's say they come to you for some legal advice. You going to give it to them?
Unfortunately, no. Escrow holders are not legal counsels. We will try it to the best of our ability, address the question if it is an escrow question.
Mhm.
However, if it is a legal question or a tax question or anything that's outside of our scope of ability, we will help to direct that person or that buyer and seller to the appropriate party.
You know, it's interesting because as a lender, people would always come to me for legal questions, for answers.
We
rather.
get the same thing.
They would come to me for the answers to legal questions, and I certainly would know the answers, but you cross a very, I mean, you walk a very thin line, rather, by giving legal advice, because if you're ever wrong, it's just like giving financial advice. You have to be very, very careful.
Very careful.
Because if you're wrong, then you
Very
could be in a lot of
careful.
trouble, and who needs that, right?
Mhm. I have a whole team of people that I can refer my clients to should they need advice.
So let's say I get the escrow instructions and I have some questions. What do I do?
You call your escrow officer first, and if it happens to be a question that we're capable of answering, we'll certainly take any time that that client needs to answer that question adequately. If it's a question that's outside of our realm, we will again refer them to the appropriate party. Most often, the buyer and seller, if they're not comfortable with their escrow holder, then they will pick up the phone and call their realtor. And most of my realtors are very capable of answering the same questions.
Uh-huh.
But I always encourage the buyer and seller to call me directly.
Yeah, and I think you and I are in a service business, and I think,
Absolutely.
boy, the day we don't return our calls and
Mhm.
give wonderful service, we're kind of out of business. Is that a fair statement?
That is a very fair statement. A real estate transaction for a buyer and seller, next to death and divorce, is one of the most stressful things that they can go through.
Right,
So it's our job to make them feel more comfortable with what they're doing.
right. Absolutely a good point. How are the buyers and the sellers' costs determined?
The buyer's costs and seller's costs for any transaction are determined based on the size of the transaction and the complexity of the transaction. Here in Southern California, the escrow fees typically are paid equally by the buyer and seller.
So what happens at the close of escrow?
Well, in order for us to get to a closing, we have to determine that all of the terms and conditions in the contract have been met. The lender, the buyer's new lender, if they're obtaining financing, is ready to fund that loan. And all of our funds are collected funds or good funds, that we've made sure that all of the funds that we're getting are ready to be transferred. And at that point in time, then we will authorize the recordable documents to be recorded down at the county recorder's office. That will legally transfer the title from the seller to the buyer. We
Mhm.
do our final settlement. Everybody is notified, and the buyer should be able to take possession of their brand new home.
Just like that, hopefully.
Just like that.
Now, if it's a refinance, it's a little different. So when a refinance closes, if they are taking cash out, then everything closes, and then a check goes to them from you, or do you send them a check, or do you wire funds, or how's it normally work?
We go based on their instructions. We will offer
Mhm.
them the options: wire transfer, pick up a check,
Mhm.
deliver a check to their broker, whatever they prefer that we do.
Okay. Now, I know that the rules, the way the game is played this year is different from last year due to a lot of new RESPA rules. So tell me how your business is different
Yeah.
this year from. And
That's putting it lightly.
I think it's
Yeah.
less fun. I think that would be a fair way to put it.
I don't know if it's less fun. It's more challenging. It's a lot more challenging.
More politically.
We have had to really stay on top of our game and learn a lot of new rules, a lot of new
Mhm.
tricks this year
Mhm.
due to the RESPA regulations.
Mhm.
We feel quite proud here at the company that I work for that we have had extensive training in the new regulations,
Mhm.
so we really feel much more comfortable with the regulations. When they first rolled out at the beginning of the year, it was pretty frightening,
Mhm.
but as the year has rolled through, we've gotten more and more used to the documents. It's just a different lending world these days than it ever used to be, and I'm
Mhm.
sure that you see the same thing every day.
Well, it used to be where, to some degree, common sense, maybe they went to too much of an extreme,
Mhm.
where common sense underwriting
Mhm.
applied, but now it doesn't.
I believe it's a pendulum.
Mhm.
You know, a few years back it was over this way and it's going over this way, and it'll go back. It'll go back in the middle.
And talking about it, since you brought up a few years back, and I wasn't going to mention this, but I remember, and I'll never forget this, when I was at Great Western, and the year was 1994, and we were in a similar situation, similar pattern of homes homes losing value, underwriters tightening up, and it was difficult for people like me to do
Mhm.
business. But miraculously, I was able to get some of my loans through. One which was yours,
One of mine.
and you had purchased your home, and all the escrows were hard to put through at that time.
Yes, they were.
And I don't think you did your own escrow, though you might have.
No, I did not.
And I was able to get, well, you were well qualified, so I was able to get you a loan. And the escrow closed on a Friday, one of the few loans I was funding then. And what happened Monday?
The 1994 earthquake hit.
Yep, and your house was destroyed. So I said that.
No, my house wasn't
It was
destroyed.
in
No.
pretty bad shape.
Yeah.
I do remember that. That
It was pretty frightening, but I still had my house.
One of the things that crossed my mind when the earthquake hit was the fact that, my God, I just closed Diane Keith. You weren't married at that time.
That's correct.
And so, actually, as a byproduct of that, you met somebody.
I did.
Yes.
I did. And we've now been married
Amazing.
11 years.
Amazing how.
I met my husband, who was
No.
my neighbor at the time. Didn't know it.
So, had it not been for me, you might not have ever met
That's
him.
very true.
Thank you very
That's
much.
very true.
Anyway, I think we're done. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this video on the subject. We had a good time, and have a nice day. Thank you.